Good evening, everyone. I thought I would record a video that essentially is the video companion to the blog that I wrote recently. I will also be using this as essentially the trailer video for my channel. I called it the Independence Manifesto. Why must we accept someone else's political platform instead of having our own? I used once again this piece of art that I feel illustrates my views. In the farewell address of George Washington, the first president of the United States, who was also the only independent president, he mentioned having serious reservations about the party system that was coming into power as he was leaving government. He had run unopposed for his position as president and appointed Thomas Jefferson to his cabinet, specifically because he knew that Jefferson's political views were not the same as his own. Take a second to drink that in. Basically, George Washington, in his integrity, knew that he needed to have people who opposed his political views in his immediate circle, in the government. You don't really see a lot of that anymore. In England, where most of the Founding Fathers came from, literal civil wars were fought between political parties, and this led to the decision specifically not to mention political parties whatsoever in the Constitution. From History.com, George Washington's family had fled England precisely to avoid the civil wars there, while Alexander Hamilton once called political parties the most fatal disease of popular governments. James Madison, who worked with Hamilton to defend the new Constitution to the public in the Federalist Papers, wrote in Federalist 10 that one of the functions of a well-constructed union should be its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. Despite this, political parties did develop within the United States, much to its detriment, and many of the warnings that George Washington put in his farewell address were, rather than warnings to be heeded, dire predictions of what would come to pass. From the farewell address of George Washington: in contemplating the causes which may disturb our Union, it occurs as matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. In other words, in very flowery, old-school language, parties are not good for unity of the people as a whole. Further on, all obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associations, under whatever plausible character, with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities, are destructive of this fundamental principle, and of fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation the will of the party. In other words, in place of the will of the nation would become the will of these political parties. Often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community. And according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests. However, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends. They are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view, and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed, but in those of the popular form it is seen in its greatest rankness, and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction or another, over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than its competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of its own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it in the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. Which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. In other words, political parties themselves essentially are a threat not only to our democracy, but to our national security. It was clear to Washington and several of the other founding fathers that there was a serious danger in the party system, as individuals would band together to do what was best for their party instead of what was best for the country. And what was good for the people at large would always be secondary to the power and influence that their specific faction had over the others. This is why you see efforts on part of both major parties to seek to undermine legislation or appointments of positions, and in general fight against any efforts from across the aisle in a fight over dominance. They will seek to sabotage the efforts of any president of an opposing party, for example, specifically to make their party look weak or ineffective, even if whatever measures they are thwarting would be good for the people like you and me. When you add to this fact that people with more money, and therefore more money for campaign donations, will inevitably have considerable power and influence over our elected officials, the system further breaks down. Gerrymandering is perhaps the most obvious example of parties seeking to get a ridiculous stranglehold on power for their party at the expense of the citizens of the United States that they live in. Literally, jigsaw puzzling districts together to ensure their party has the majority of seats in the House and Senate. You end up with crazy situations where the governor of a given state, elected by that state's majority, is opposed by a state legislature that is for some reason totally dominated by the opposing party. This picture is an example of an actual state legislature districts drawn up by members of political parties who are literally creating districts that are only populated by their party. So let's take a closer look at this. These are actual districts. Basically, they draw up through gerrymandering, which is a process in which these districts are designed, districts that are entirely made up only of their party. And then they will take people of the opposing party and also put them in districts, but crowd them together, and it's in a process essentially to be sure that your state legislature is entirely taken over by one party or the other. This ridiculous corruption of our democratic republic system is exactly the sort of nonsense that George Washington was concerned about, but I doubt even the Founding Fathers in all of their wisdom would have ever dreamed that the parties would simply create zones for themselves to rule within our republic. And to be clear, while the Republican Party did perhaps do more of this recently in states like Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, etc., the Democrats have done plenty of this as well. In my shows with Clint Curtis, he revealed that he was called on by the same people that asked him to write election rigging software for voting machines to write a computer program to assist in gerrymandering. And you can listen to my shows with Mr. Curtis here. Those links will be here in this blog, which will be linked in the description to the show. There is also the issue of how our electoral system itself has been completely corrupted by the party system. The reason, for example, that Bernie Sanders, a lifelong independent, had to seek the nomination for president by joining the Democrats is due to the ballot access laws that have been put in place to ensure that the two-party duopoly remains in power. One thing that the two parties agree on for sure is maintaining their dominance in all of our political system. We are made to choose from a very small number of hand-picked candidates for all of our important offices, and it is extremely rare that an independent or third-party candidate manages to penetrate the system. Governor Jesse Ventura managed to win the election in Minnesota, but it was entirely predicated on his celebrity status getting him into the debates. During his time as governor, both parties worked together to thwart his agenda to ensure that he would not seek re-election. Perhaps the best example of this was the 2016 Democratic primary. It was revealed through the hacked emails that the DNC had actively worked to steal the nomination from Bernie Sanders. Angry members of the party filed a lawsuit against the Democratic Party, citing that they had donated money to the party under the impression that the process would be a fair and democratic one. What was perhaps the most disturbing revelation that came out of this situation was that the lawyers working for the DNC literally defended the DNC by stating that the political parties are private entities that could literally pick their candidates in back rooms if they wanted to. As in, yes, that's actually in the transcripts of the court proceeding. And they were right. And they won. Many people are still unaware of the fact that the political party system is not in the Constitution. Many people are unaware that there are reasons why. Two private, unconstitutional organizations control access to the ballot, access to the debates, and as a result, access to the highest offices in our country. To my Republican friends, don't for a moment think that your party is exempt from this. In 2008, Congressman Ron Paul ran on an anti-war platform, and I distinctly remember him being excluded from debates at one point in favor of Rudy Giuliani, despite the fact that Ron Paul consistently polled higher than Giuliani in every state. And more recently, don't forget that your party didn't want Donald Trump at all. Jeb Bush was their guy, as the Bushes are exactly like the Clintons in that they are both deep state favorites. The major political parties are bought and paid for. They have become instruments of plutocracy, ruled by the wealthy. They distract us by taking stances on social issues that they feel will garner favor, but this evolves entirely on their fancy. The Republicans, for example, historically were the party that moved to abolish slavery, yet the Democrats are now understood to be the party for people of color. It is perhaps the greatest illusion that any citizen of the United States can allow themselves to be caught up in to believe that either of these parties care about you, and even the third parties have that same sort of infighting and corruption at their core. The Green Party, for example, has a candidate who was favored by party insiders in ways that are perhaps even worse than the favoritism showed to Hillary Clinton in 2016. In one Green Party primary, Howie Hawkins was literally the only candidate on the ballot, despite Dario Hunter, his main rival, being sent an email confirming that he had done everything that was needed to be on the ballot. I say it's time to stop surrendering your beliefs to parties. Make these parties earn your vote. Instead of joining these parties and having them take you for granted, which they most certainly do, be one of those voters who will decide solely by which candidate actually is the closest to their beliefs, and overall, stop settling, meaning settling for candidates. Political parties have become like competing religions, and you are expected to go along with all of that religion's doctrines to the letter, even when they contradict each other, even when that you don't agree with one critical aspect but do agree with another. It's an unnatural way of thinking that only suits us when we surrender to groupthink and cease to think for ourselves. Since I don't want to offend anyone from a specific party, let me make up some fictional parties for the sake of my analogy. Disclaimer: this is a work of fiction. Names, characters, platforms, corruptions, contradictions, and hypocrisies detailed within are the products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual political parties, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Wink, wink. Here we have the Jackassocrats and the Dumbokins. One is pro-welfare, one is anti-welfare, one is pro-abortion, one is anti-abortion, one is pro-healthcare, one is anti-healthcare, one is pro-gun control, one is anti-gun control, one is anti-police, one is pro-police, one is anti-drug war, one is pro-drug war, one is pro-union, pro-deregulation, pro-war. This is the part actually that's the most disturbing. Pro-corporations, always wealthy, anti-third party, and anti-third party, meaning that one thing that they can always agree on is that they definitely don't want the tree huggers, or the pricks, or the independents to get anywhere in our political system. They're definitely unified in that. The people who get caught up in these political cults are expected to follow their platform dogma to the letter. There is no room for any deviation. For example, Bernie Sanders is actually pro-gun rights and is a left-leaning independent. Because he is seeking the nomination for the jackass Democratic Party, He has to revise his position on this issue, as it is expected of him. This situation also creates strange contradictions. So, for example, the Jackassocrats are pro-abortion yet anti-death penalty. The Dumbokins are anti-abortion but also anti-welfare for the same kids they demand that mothers give birth to. The Jackassocrats at least currently seem to want to abolish or defund the police, yet are opposed to private gun ownership for people to be able to defend themselves. But perhaps more disturbing than the things the parties say or do to contradict themselves there is what they agree on, and this kind of reveals the truth of the matter. Both of these parties actually serve the same corporate masters. The military-industrial complex likes war, so they do. The medical-industrial complex dislikes Medicare for all, so they also dislike Medicare for all. Big money interests are at the top of their priority list, and we the people are basically just here to pay the bills. So getting back to reality for a moment, consider, for example, the first economic stimulus packages offered by the Democratic Congress and the Republican Senate in the wake of COVID-19. The jackasses, I mean Democrats of course, put together a huge corporate bailout, and then 2 weeks of paid sick leave, which they of course put in the fine print only businesses with less than 500 employees would have to pay. In other words, only small businesses would have to offer any extra help to the people. The businesses literally in the worst circumstances. In fact, there seems to be an effort to choke small businesses to death while propping up big businesses and big corporations. We are looking at a future where the major retailers are Amazon and Walmart, two companies that pay very little in taxes, if any. Then the Dumbokins, I mean Republicans, offered a one-time payment of $1,200 that initially was proposed to come out of our next tax return, and that would be adjusted down for the tax burden of the people involved. This amounted to the poorest people with no tax liability getting a whopping $300, which is less than even the average paycheck of a minimum wage worker. Meanwhile, they made sure to take care of their corporate masters, forking over billions and billions to companies, and the wealthiest in our country strangely all increased their net worth while the rest of us are struggling to get by. Do you see the pattern? These parties don't give a damn about you, and now they are playing political football with our future as the ball. Ironically, Donald Trump as the executive has done more in the past 4 months to help us than either of the major parties. Whether this is for his own political gain is of course questionable, as it would be for anyone in his position, but in the face of this pandemic, neither party has prioritized anyone but their donors. This is my message to activists on both sides of this issue. Reject the parties entirely. They are unconstitutional entities strangling our democracy. They are vehicles for the plutocrats to control our system. They are set up in such a way to keep us fighting each other over social issues that neither of them actually really care about, while the one class they continue to serve are the wealthy and the deep state over any of us. They want us distracted with race, gender, religion, etc. to keep us from uniting against them, to keep us from picking our candidates on their sincerity rather than their membership of one cult or another. Reject the illusion of choice. Reclaim your liberty. You can support Trump or Bernie or whomever as an independent, as our system was originally intended. Stop donating to political parties. Stop joining them unless you have to temporarily to do so just to participate in a primary. Fight for ranked choice voting so that third-party or independent candidates have a chance. Support candidates as individuals rather than as members of political cults. So, to clarify, if you want to continue to support Trump or Bernie Sanders or anybody really, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, even if they are members of major parties, but do so as an individual. For example, Bernie Sanders wants me to vote for Joe Biden. That's not going to happen, and that's because I'm not a sycophantic member of any cult. I supported him because I liked his policies and I liked his attitude and I believe in him. I don't believe in Joe Biden. If you want to continue to support Trump and that's who you support, then do so as an individual. Don't surrender, your ability to think for yourself to these political cults that in many cases don't even really represent you. That's actually something else that I wanted to point out about this graphic that I put together, was that I would say naturally a lot of people are not going to fit evenly into these little, pig troughs that they've stuck us in. So, for example, I'm pro-gun rights, but I'm also pro-welfare. Where do I fit? Apparently I don't. What if somebody's pro-life, but is also pro-welfare? What if somebody is, against the war on drugs? There's just any way you look at it, there's just all these different ways that there are people who are going to not fit into these positions. And we are expected essentially to follow these packages when the truth is I don't even think these packages actually really are suited to anybody. And they're full of contradictions intentionally by design for the purposes essentially of keeping us fighting each other over these things. See, like the stuff that they don't have in common, this is all bullshit. They don't really care about any of these things. It's not really important to them on a personal level. The things that they actually care about are everything below this line here. Pro-war, pro-corporations, always wealthy, meaning these candidates always seem to be wealthy. And they definitely agree, again, on no tree huggers, no pricks, and no independents. Yes, that's the Green Party. Yes, that's the Libertarian Party. And yes, these are the independents. But that's why I'm telling you people, think for yourself. If these don't fit you, don't feel that you're forced to pick one. I just talked to a voter the other day, somebody actually who contacted me because my video about Kyle Rittenhouse changed their opinion on the issue. But they had to contact me privately about it because they were concerned that their jackassocrat friends would be really upset with them if they found out that they weren't following along with what that group thought. And I've also had people, for example, from this side of things who came to me and told me later that they voted for Bernie Sanders in the open primary, even though they probably still planned to vote for Trump in the general election. But they acknowledged that what I said was true about Bernie being a genuinely good person, that even if they don't agree with his ideas, they think that he's certainly a better person than Joe Biden, and definitely was a better person than Hillary Clinton. We have to be able to have more conversations where this sort of nonsense is no longer relevant, where we can be judged as individuals. Just like George Washington, our first president, and the only president to ever be elected without a party. So, with all of that said, I'm going to take you down and leave you with some words from George Carlin.
But there's a reason. There's a reason. There's a reason for this. There's a reason education sucks, and it's the same reason that it will never, ever, ever be fixed. It's never going to get any better. Don't look for it. Be happy with what you got. Because the owners of this country don't want that. I'm talking about the real owners now. The big, the wealthy, the real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. They're irrelevant. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets. And they own all the big media news, all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right. You know something? They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table and figure out how badly they're getting fucked by a system that threw them overboard 30 fucking years ago. They don't want that. You know what they want? They want obedient workers. Obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly shittier jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. And now they're coming for your Social Security money. They want your fucking retirement money. They want it back so they can give it to their criminal friends on Wall Street. And you know something? They'll get it. They'll get it all from you sooner or later because they own this fucking place. It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club. And by the way, it's the same big club they used to beat you over the head with all day long when they tell you what to believe. All day long, beating you over the head in their media, telling you what to believe, what to think, and what to buy. The table is tilted, folks. The game is rigged. And nobody seems to notice. Nobody seems to care. Good, honest, hard-working people, white collar, blue collar, doesn't matter what color shirt you have on. Good, honest, hard-working people continue. These are people of modest means. Continue to elect these rich cocksuckers who don't give a fuck about them. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't care about you at all, at all, at all.